You're listening to The Sound of Pursuit. I'm Hal Humphreys.
And I'm John Nardizzi. Today we're going to be talking about China and Iran hiring U.S. detectives unwittingly. After the U.S. shot down a Chinese spy balloon in the skies over North America, focus has been in the sky. But the Chinese government also had its eye on the ground, using unwitting private detectives in the U.S. to illegally obtain intelligence on dissidents in this country. Derek Taylor, a California-based private investigator who used to work as a federal agent with the Department of Homeland Security, allegedly asked a co-conspirator for information on the immigration status of political dissidents living in the U.S., people targeted by the Chinese Communist Party.
And it turns out, John, China's not the only one. Iran is another. One investigator, Michael McKeever, was hired for a seemingly routine job of surveillance of a debtor who owed money in Dubai. But in reality, the target was an Iranian journalist who had criticized the dictatorial regime in her country.
Yeah.
I guess my question is, John, how does this happen? How do private investigators end up unwittingly working for foreign actors, foreign state actors at that?
Yeah, and I think part of the thing that we wanted to do here was alert the profession, alert the PI industry that this is happening. These are not the only cases. There have been other cases involving U.S.-based private detectives because we know how to get intelligence. We know how to do surveillance in this country. We know how to get background research. So some of these governments of countries like Iran, China, and other, I think it's fair to say, non-allies at a minimum, they're going to hire people in this country indirectly, and I think that's the key. Although I think those two cases are very different, and we'll talk a little bit about why they are different. And I think everybody has to be on guard. You have to have some tests in place to make sure you're not one of these people who is hired by one of these governments to possibly break the law.
Yeah, and there was a book written a couple of years ago about the Harvey Weinstein case, and in
Oh
that
yeah,
case, they had hired some foreign operatives had hired some private investigators locally through a friend of a friend kind of thing, and there were some real problems with that. So, John, when you're dealing with a situation where you've got a client that you don't know, how do you go about protecting yourself from working for bad actors?
one thing that I always do, and we'll get into the specifics a little bit of these cases, but at a minimum, this question has come up before in some of our discussions about people that want to hire you anonymously, where you don't know who the true client is. Sometimes it's done through a lawyer, sometimes it's done through a business. And sometimes dangled with that, and I've had it happen to me on several occasions, is a large sum of money. So, in other words, they're trying to buy your lack of due diligence on your own client, give you a big retainer. Sometimes it's bigger, really, than what the case warrants, and that's a big red flag right there. If they describe it as a simple surveillance case and they're giving you 50 grand, but you're not going to know who the client is, right there you should be stopping in your tracks. Why would somebody do that? Who's really behind it? There's so many reasons not to do that. I can't even, we could talk a lot about the different reasons. One of them is, first off, you could be working against your own clients who you trust, so you never would ever want to do that. And number two, I just think you should know, where is this information going? It's just a kind of a bare ethical minimum that I think we should all care about. I don't want to work for somebody like in these two cases here.
Yeah, and
Personally,
the idea of, most of the time when I'm asked to work on a case, I take the time to do a conflict check just to make sure that I'm not conflicted out of
yeah,
working on the case. And you can't do that if you don't know who the client is. And the other
exactly.
thing is
Yep.
$50,000 for 2 days worth of surveillance or whatever it is. I mean, there's this notion of reasonable and customary fees, which, that varies state by state and, firm by firm, but there is a reasonable and customary fee that if you're if someone's offering to pay you way above what is customary, what is reasonable, like you said, that's a red flag. That's a thing to think, wait a minute, does this make
Yeah,
sense?
right. And I think some of the reasons too that are given, and we'll go into one aspect of the Iranian case here. But one of the reasons that sometimes is given is the attorney or the front person is protecting sensitive information. So you can't get the information, you can't find out who the real client is because the attorney has to protect that sensitivity. There's a family involved, an individual. I don't buy that. There has to be an element of trust between you and that person, and that includes having that sensitive. We're in the business of sensitive information, so you should never let your guard drop in those kinds of situations.
And kind of,
There
kind of
are,
my,
we all know what the. Go ahead.
kind of my thought on that is either I'm on the team or I'm not on the team.
Right, exactly. If you don't trust me, then find somebody else who you do trust. But that's not a. I just will not partner up with somebody who already has doubts, or whether they're real doubts or just sort of fake, fake doubts. Take the money and don't ask any questions, kind of scenario.
We had a long talk with another investigator out in Los Angeles this past summer, talking about this very topic, and he was bringing up the idea of working for Russian oligarchs, and a lot of times they will try to hire private investigators in the United States, and again, it's not always immediately easy to tell that you're being hired by someone that's possibly a bad actor. But there are always red flags that you can look for.
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes I've had uncomfortable conversations. I mean, I was hired once. I'm thinking of there was a wealthy gentleman in Boston who had a legitimate court case, and we were doing interviews on that case. And the interviews is oftentimes a way that they're legitimate interviews, and you're getting information that can be used in the court case, or the person is sort of sending the investigator out to just bother people. And at some point, pretty quickly, we realized these people really had no helpful information. We got some information from some of the witnesses about our own client, and we had a very direct conversation with that client and just cut them loose. We said, no more, we're done, and returned the unused fees and just moved on.
Yeah, and,
So
and and for investigators that come up with a situation like this, we've had this conversation before. If you've got to do mental gymnastics to get to a yes, that's your ethical compass telling you might want to say no. But
right,
I've talked to investigators who have said, "Look, this is really good money, and they're not asking me to do anything illegal. I'm doing surveillance, which anybody could do, right? Anybody could see what they're doing in the public street. But what are the implications of doing surveillance on someone who is possibly a dissident in another country?"
yeah, and I think that brings us to these two cases. One of these cases involved surveillance of a woman who was a journalist, and uh, my understanding, reading the indictment and some of the case documents and news media pieces, was that the investigator tried to do his due diligence and actually asked for some confirmation on certain things, like who are her roommates, uh, what other addresses do you have, like normal things that you would do if you're doing surveillance. And his contact point, an Iranian agent, fair to say, was not giving that information. And I think that that's the kind of thing where you have to ask yourself, why is this information not coming? And if again, some of these people are being indicted because they're breaking federal law by working in that case. So you can say I'm just doing surveillance, but if you don't know who you're doing surveillance for, you can't work for a foreign government.
You know,
So
we've talked before about intended use and intended user, and those two questions are kind of key for us for developing a scope of work and what we can and cannot do. And if you don't know who the intended user is, and you don't know what the intended use is, you could get yourself into some trouble if you're not careful.
yeah, and just to add on to this idea that you can work for whomever you want. You can work for the U.S. government, foreign governments in some cases, but you can't work for a foreign government or an agent that has been declared to be on you know, a list of people you can't do business with because of who they are. And we all know what those federal lists are, the exclusionary lists and debarred parties lists and those sorts of things. And you have to know if the person contacting you is actually a front person for one of those companies. So I think that surveillance case is sort of unique in that aspect.
Yeah,
The
and
other case involves classified documents. That's a little bit different.
yeah. So the surveillance case, was there an indictment filed against the investigator in that case?
I believe he was warned more than
Okay.
indicted. I think there was
Okay.
some indictments of other people, but I think he was sort of warned that, hey, you're working for the Iranian government here, and
Yeah, and that in and of itself
that,
is a problem.
yeah, yeah.
In the
But the other
financial,
case involved.
I'm sorry, in
Go
the
ahead.
financial world, there's this concept of know your customer. Um,
Right.
and I know legally that may not apply to us, but I think ethically it kind of does.
Oh, I think absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And I think we're obligated to do some basic due diligence on anybody who hires us, just as you said for a conflict check, but also just ethically, you should know who you're working for in every case, and don't be lured by sort of the promise of big funds for looking the other way and not taking the normal steps.
Right. The other case you were talking about involved getting documents that are not public record. Talk to me about that one.
Yeah, that one looks a little more straightforward. I mean, this has been reported maybe for the last couple of months, but the California investigator used his old contacts, and we've seen, we all know these stories. Somebody leaves a federal agency or a state agency or a police force. They go back and they ask informal questions, stand behind somebody's desk, look at a computer. You hear these stories of people who have that ability, and sort of it atrophies over time. Obviously, they can't do that sometimes 4 or 5 years because nobody remembers them at the office or people have retired. But in this case, he was asking for immigration status information. In some cases, I think even confirmation, maybe documents about people who are political dissidents, and looks like he's been indicted. So that's a different twist than the first case.
And that for me falls kind of in the same category as the investigator who's out there and says, I can get bank records on someone. I can find their bank balances and where they have money and all this. I can get financial records, which is strictly verboten unless you have permission from the subject of an investigation. So, you know,
Yeah,
at the end of the day, if you're going after something that is not allowed, if your client is asking you to get something that is not allowed, that's not even a hard question. That's a no.
yeah. And I would throw in also the old cell phone records, information brokers. The idea that you can just get somebody's cell phone records, very clearly running afoul of federal law, and you just have to move on from it. You're gonna. The sad thing is, on some of these cases, when you think about the amount of money that the person's being paid, in this case, one of the articles says the exchange was like, expensive Cuban cigars or fancy tequila. I mean, you're giving information and risking your reputation for something. It seems like you're just doing a favor, but you got to be really, really careful and think about what is it worth it? For a nice box of Cubans? Probably not.
Probably not. Let's talk about the ethics of this. Can private investigators work for anonymous clients? And why would one ever do that?
Can they? I don't think they. Again, I think the minimum standard of vetting your client, I don't think you can. And if you run afoul of working of working against one of your old clients, you could be sued for that, because the claim would be that you're using information that you gained in the course of a representation. Remember, if you're an investigator working for a law firm, working for an attorney, you're the agent of the attorney. All those attorney-client privilege and work product, two different things, they apply to you, and you could be breaching those obligations. So you can't do it.
Yeah, yeah.
I really do. I think it's a firm line. I don't think you can, and might not be spelled out in the regulations that way, but I think the practicality is you can't legitimately work for anonymous clients.
Right. And how do let's talk about how other investigators can vet their clients to avoid being used for, bad actors.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think, we all have the databases where we can quickly check to see if somebody is who they say they are. Does it match up with the phone number that the call came in on, or does it match up with the email? Does the website look legitimate? So you can certainly do that. And in other cases, I think it's just a practical aspect. Like if we were talking about, if you're asking for certain documents and the client is not forthcoming or giving you resistance, that's a real red flag for me.
Yeah, I'm with you 100% there. I think that's fairly straightforward. And again, I like to work for attorneys. I think there's a little bit of protection to me there when I'm working for an attorney. That said, not all attorneys are cut from the same cloth. Some of them are out there doing, dastardly deeds. The
Yeah,
benefit of working with an attorney in that situation is if you find out that they're out there doing dastardly deeds or representing foreign nationals or foreign government actors, you can then walk away from it and stop the work. But it's a real problem, and I've seen several stories of late along the lines of the ones you're talking about. And I was actually talking to Marcy Phelps. Um,
hmm
last week. Amazing reference librarian turned investigator over in North
yeah,
Carolina. If anybody in the North Carolina area or anywhere in the country really needs some due diligence work, Marcy is an amazing investigator. And she talked about, if I'm doing background research for a merger and acquisition or something like that, and I find a watch list notice on my subject, that is a time to stop the investigation and call my client and say, "Hey, this is what I found. What do we need to do?" I mean, it's available to us
yeah,
as private investigators. It's a thing you need to do.
right, yeah, yeah. She's a great researcher. I've read her posts on different things, and I think she's right on target with that. Yeah, and but I will come back on that a little bit. I've heard other investigators talk about having an attorney, sort of as the maybe like a seawall in between them and the danger. And I sometimes I feel like some attorneys may be the danger. I mean, I'm not talking about my clients that I trust and I've worked with, but I never assume just because somebody's a lawyer that they're going to be uh, accurate on some of the issues that we face and advising us on some of those issues. And I also feel that sometimes members of the public, we're almost in competition with lawyers in some cases. They don't want to. They might just need some information. This might be a client. I still think it's fine to work for people directly in some cases, and I often do. But that's just a judgment call that everybody has to make.
Yeah, and when I say I rely on my attorneys as a little bit of a foil, at the end of the day, I mean, uh, you've never had an attorney lie to you, have you, John?
Oh no, that's never happened.
I mean, attorneys are people too. There are bad actors in that world, just like there are bad actors in the world of private investigators. My advice is work with attorneys that you're comfortable with, get to know them. The longer you work with them, the more comfortable you get working with them. And the ones that respect you as an investigator are the ones you want to work for. Um,
Absolutely.
so yeah. Well, John, I think this has been an interesting little conversation. It certainly has been eye opening for
Yeah.
me to think about those things. Real quick before we get out of here, I had a chat with a friend of mine. This is a total non sequitur, and I did not prep you for this, so you can say I don't know or whatever. But a very dear friend of mine named Chris has a young daughter who is just getting into her chemistry major at university, and she's really leaning towards going into forensic science. And he was saying, she's kind of curious about, forensic science gets a lot of press in the criminal justice system these days. What are some
Yeah.
things that you would give her as advice for how to work in that field? And I'll tell you what I said first, and I want to get your take on it. What I told
Yeah.
him was, tell her it's good to be a science nerd. You have to do that job. It's good to know the chemistry inside and out. But if you're going to be in the criminal justice field doing that kind of work, learn how to explain very complex things in very simple terms so that normal human beings can understand it. That was my advice. What are your thoughts on a kid going into, their second year university, thinking about going to, forensic science? What would you say to them?
Related to that, I think obviously this person has the chops, the science chops, to succeed in that area, to do forensics. The ability to write, the ability to communicate cleanly, as you said, to non-experts, is the key, because you and I both review expert reports, and the ones that are long and filled with jargon and scientific terms and things that nobody else understands other than the writer don't go very far. The succinct summaries that you sometimes get written by somebody who really understands it, worth their weight in gold. And I've seen that on so many cases where we talk about what expert was really valuable. We'll say that cell phone forensics guy that just explained everything, how a cell tower works very cleanly with examples and analogies that we could all understand. Phenomenal. Great. So I think learning how to write, learning how to testify, learning how to communicate to lay people is the key.
Yeah.
Because they've already got the science background.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We also
Great
talked
move, though.
We also talked about the you've heard this term, you've been in the courtroom a number of times, the CSI effect.
Yeah.
Juries want to get a final determination that this person's DNA was found in the hotel room. It's like, you just can't say that.
Right. Yeah, and really, instead of the CSI effect, you just have the dueling experts, and which one is telling the story, the plain story, in a more creative or telling way. The details that really sway a jury. So sometimes you're right. There is no CSI effect. It's who's telling the better story.
I mean, I think at the end of the day, a trial is nothing more than a storytelling competition, and the better storyteller almost always wins. Talk about the dueling expert thing, and this will be the last thing we talk about before we part ways for the day. I've been in trial situations where there have been two experts on opposite sides of an issue, and they get into jargon and they get into their own little world, and they're arguing minute points of whatever the topic is. And not only is the entire jury just about to fall asleep, the judge is about to fall asleep, and ain't nobody getting anything out of that.
Yeah, those are the afternoons that you dread, where you're sitting there realizing you got 4 more hours of that. Yeah.
Well, John, thanks for being here today. This has been a good chat, and we'll take this recorded version of the podcast and get it published here in the next little bit.
Excellent.
Yeah.
First day of spring, and looking forward to doing more. I busted out the plaid baby. Came out on the first day of spring with the plaid jacket, which I know violates all the rules of podcasting, but
here's the thing. You can wear whatever you want as long as you wear something.
Thank you. As long as the door opens.
You've been listening to The Sound of Pursuit. I'm Hal Humphreys.
I'm John Nardizzi.
We'll see you guys next week. Thanks.